Untamed by the laws of man, the Giantdowns region remains independent from the ruined Empire of Onware and its northern neighbor, the Rurik Highlands. The Great Downs themselves are said to be a beautiful sight to behold, and rumors abound of giants being buried beneath the mounds, awaiting some call to rise and battle once more. The region houses dangers enough between monstrous humanoids, giantkin, and monsters of their own, which are said to be gathering under the banner of some new Anshalan for its own malicious purposes. An expedition has been put together to take control of the region and place it in the hands of a worthy ruler to protect Rurik or Onwarian interests. Many have tried to conquer the region before, and their bodies lay beneath the barrow mounds, littered throughout the regions, as their spirits haunt the Giantdowns, refighting their ancient battles over and over again. Many have tried to conquer the region before. Are these new conquerors doomed to have their bones lay beneath the Great Downs, or will someone finally be crowned the king of the Giantdowns? So hello, my name is Michael Sigler, and I am running a Birthright campaign using the 3.5 rules of Dungeons & Dragons and the robust Birthright conversion that is done in conjunction with WotC and the fan community. I am a very experienced DM. I've been DMing for over 10 years now, over 13 years now, which is over half my life, and I'm playing with a group of very experienced players. I have kind of wanted to set about doing a campaign diary for this campaign, because I generally enjoy other people's campaign diaries and like living through their campaigns vicariously. So I thought that there might be some sort of a audience for this. I'll probably update this sporadically. I have a pretty busy schedule with work and school, but we play regularly, so I should be able to update in big chunks of the goings on in the campaign, if not directly correlating to session. So a little bit about the campaign. Like I said, it will be run in the Birthright setting of Soralia, in the northern region of the northern marches near the Rurik Highlands, in a region known as the Giantdowns, which is a established region that is a Borderlands region that is not really laid claim by anyone. It's kind of between the remnants of the Onwarian Empire and the current present-day Rurik Highlands. So no one really lays claim over it as of yet, and a lot of people have tried to in the past lay claim over it. This campaign will be focusing on the players actually going around and earning the loyalty of the denizens of the Downs, and conquering the region for their own purposes through guile and winning the loyalty over of the citizenry. There's a variety of threats facing the players as they run through this campaign, and I will be kind of outlining some big ideas here for this campaign and kind of introducing you to the cast of characters, as well as updating you on the information of our that we went over in our session 0. Our session 0 was kind of, I took each player aside and ran them on their own little solo adventure, which all combined together, so they're all gathered together and about to set off on this expedition in 2 days when we have our next session. So, a little bit about the King of the Giantdowns. This is a original adventure published in, I want to say, 1996. I don't have it off the top of my head. Created by the legendary Ed Stark, and not the Game of Thrones one. And it is, I would say, a very good adventure. I eventually want to do a review of it. I would like to get a physical copy. Currently, I am restricted to a PDF, and I just love the old Birthright art. It's definitely one of the things that appeals to me about the setting. For those of you unfamiliar with the Birthright setting, I like to describe it as a mix between like a very high political setting, like Game of Thrones, kind of a mix between Game of Thrones and Highlander, where the focus is around characters who are regents, so-called blooded regents, because they have the the divine right of kings is real in this, right? Your kings are literally have the blood of gods in them. and are set to rule over the kingdom, right? So they have this divine connection to the land that allows them to rule. Um, I will probably be going over the Birthright setting information, maybe creating an introduction to the setting at some point, which might be helpful when viewing this campaign diary in a vacuum. But I think that it is probably if you're going to be watching this, you already kind of know what Birthright is. It's a pretty obscure setting that was released in the 90s. I will say that Matt Colville had a great little live stream that he did a couple years ago where he gives a great introduction to the setting, which I would highly recommend as a primer to the setting before I create my own. So a little bit about this adventure. It's not a traditional adventure or a adventure path, which are really common these days. It is more of it's fairly open. It's essentially a setting book with a bunch of characters and a bunch of adventure ideas, and nothing really concrete even for the time. It has some like set encounters for some of their like adventures, but it mostly is just like, hey, here's this idea. We're going to do 90% of the work for you, and you're just going to do the crunch, which is absolutely perfect for my purposes because I don't like super linear adventures. I love writing my own content, but I like having something to base it on. So I'm going to be running a highly abridged version of the King of the Giantdowns. I'm going to be using a lot from the book, but I'm going to be using it very liberally. I have my own ideas about how the Rurik culture functions. I'm using the Rurik Highlands setting quite a bit, like the Rurik Highlands, a supplement book, quite a bit for reference information. I will be using a lot of the adventures ideas that they use in the book, interspersed with my own that I have for my setting. There's NPCs that will feature heavily in my campaign that are not present in the book, and there'll be different factions from different adjacent nations and stuff like that. A lot of like high-minded political stuff, which was what partially makes Birthright such a fun setting. The premise of the King of the Giantdowns, kind of the purpose of the adventure, is for your blooded player characters to actually win a region of their own. There's this region, the Giantdowns, which has no current controller over it. There's a couple people who lay claim to it, but none of them have a concrete claim. Some of them good, some of them bad. And the players can kind of step into this power vacuum and build a kingdom of their own, similar to the Pathfinder Kingmaker adventure path, if you are familiar with Pathfinder at all. Except this is almost the original to it because it came out at least a decade before. I think this adventure is really solid, and I'm very much looking forward to the campaign that it's going to provide. I think that the Giantdowns is a very interesting area and region, and there's a lot of like fun conflict between the different like Rurik people and potentially the player characters. The player characters in my campaign, none of them have any significant connections to the region, and I think there will be a quite an interesting like dynamic as they actually try to win over these quite stubborn, set in their ways, very conservative people over to their new fancy Onwarian and Brechtish ways. So I think there'll be kind of a fun dynamic to have. A couple changes that I've done from the adventure for those of you familiar with it. I have added the Watch, which is an organization of rangers that watches over the region. I have given a more Onwarian character to it. This region borders D'Sone, and so I figured that, hey, that makes a lot of sense that they have a more Onwarian character. I think there would be a lot of like mixture of Rurik and Onwarian settlers here, and I wanted a conflict between the Rurik and the Onwarians, not like a violent conflict, not necessarily, but like the players kind of have to choose: do we side with the Onwarian Watch or the Rurik tribes, the nomadic tribes, who I've also added to it. I took some ideas of nomadic tribes, and in Rurik society, like they essentially winter in with the civilized Rurik. So there's a lot of wandering Rurik tribes, and the party will have to choose: hey, do we side with the nomadic tribes, or do we decide with the Onwarians? And it'll kind of add that like interesting element of choice to it, or do they try to bridge the gap, which will come with its own difficulties. I'll probably go over more of the actual like comings and goings of the campaign and my plans for it as they come up. But I just kind of wanted to give a brief overview of some of the changes I did decide to make for those of you who've either ran the adventure before or are very familiar with it. So I am going to go on to a quick introduction of our characters, starting with Rygon of Darlinian. So, this is our Cleric Paladin. Like I said before, we are starting in 3.5, which is our kind of preferred edition to run, and it has a lot of Birthright support, as well as something that we're all familiar with. I could go into the intricacies of builds. My players love the edition because of all the options it gives you. Every one of them is going into a prestige class, but I think that it's far more important to discuss who the characters are rather than what their character sheets look like. But suffice it to say, he is a Paladin Cleric. Rygon has a very interesting bloodline ability, which has essentially allowed him... he has extremely long-lived. He is a Paladin to Halen, and despite being in his mid-40s, in reality, he still looks like and has the maturity level of someone who is 19. He is kind of almost eternally young in the same way as an elf is. He ages and matures incredibly slowly and has a massive lifespan, as that is his major bloodline ability. So potentially for future Birthright campaigns, there might be a eternal ruler in the Giantdowns. Rygon is the center of the campaign, at least in the beginning, as he has kind of formed this expedition around himself. So Rygon is that eternal youth paladin, as I said before, who is trying to live up to the singular ideals of Sir Roderick, who is one of his previous ancestors, the founder of his line, who met his foul end in the Giantdowns, originally trying to conquer it for the Onwarian Empire long ago, like centuries ago, before the Empire fell. So Rygon views his claim over the Giantdowns as almost ancestral, and following a recent bout of heroism, where he defended Piotr's Tor, a local village under his father's control, Rygon has managed to use that success to convince the Baroness Fiel de Saune, the ruler of de Saune, to sponsor this expedition and allow him to assert his claim over the Giantdowns. And so with the help of his erstwhile advisor and close friend Siamond, who is his same age at 43, actually you're younger, 42, but it doesn't have the benefit of eternal youth, so it's kind of almost a mentor figure despite them being like technically the same age. The pair of them have begun to organize a expedition to the Downs, where they plan to assert Rygon's legitimacy and rulership over it, which may bring him into conflict with some of the members of the Downs. He is a paladin of Halen, and he wields Sir Roderick's old sword, an ancient Tyvermal blade that gives him that will essentially it's a feat that he took in 3.5, which allows him to have like an ancestral weapon that levels up as he levels up, which is going to be Sir Roderick's blade. So as he becomes more powerful, as his blood gets stronger, as he begins to come into his own as a man and as a paladin, it's kind of interesting because he's kind of going through a coming of age story despite being in his mid 40s, which I find fun. Rygon will eventually succeed as the king of the Downs. And the rest of the characters are kind of being gathered around him. He's got a lot of foils in the party, but he does act as kind of a pseudo-leader. Like, he's the leader of the expedition. Next, we have Ren Ulrichson, who is one of the aforementioned foils. Ren is a Rurik individual. He is a Rurik wizard. And he is a great philosopher and orator and views himself as a skald, despite the fact that no one else really legitimizes that claim. So, for those of you who are unaware, skalds have a very particular role in Rurik society. They have like a enforced neutrality clause. They deliver messages, and if like they deliver messages, they spread like stories of valor and heroism, and then they pass down Rurik culture. And Ren doesn't really have many connections to Rurik culture, despite being Rurik by blood. He was born as a illegitimate son to the Jarless of one of the Jarlesses of Stjordvik, his mother. So he is related to a high Rurik clan, but doesn't have legitimacy, which is why he's Ulric's son and does not contain his clan name. And he has the blood of Vorin and is a naturally gifted wizard. Now, because of this natural magical tendency, his mother actually sent him away to study in the Magical College of Mudin in Brecklin, where he spent the majority of his life. So he has very little connections with Rurik, and grew up in the very cosmopolitan Brecklin and almost kind of looks down on his Rurik ancestry. His great mentor, who is a great philosopher and writer and orator, who kind of like noble dilettante, who's well known across the land, kind of tutored him, and that has colored a lot of his experiences. So he's almost got like a hedonistic bent to him. He's almost like an Epicureanist, because he describes himself as a great philosopher, and he is a very prolific writer and has achieved fame at his young age of 19. As a like up and coming intellectual. He's got a lot of like famous oratory and different writings and books that he's written, and he is serving the role as the chronicler. That's what he wants to do. He wants to chronicle this expedition. Ren returned home into Stjordvik for the first time in many years, and upon his return home, he was met with a icy reception, and essentially mocked his family, everyone in his family but his sister, and flaunted many Rurik traditions before finding out about this expedition to the Giantdowns. And his mentor, the great philosopher before him, was actually privy to another previous expedition to the Giantdowns, one that occurred 50 years ago, and which kind of piqued Ren's interest, because that expedition failed, his mentor never fully finished his book on the conquest of the Downs. So Ren now has a chance to kind of one-up his mentor. I think that Ren is a very interesting character, and I really love how his player is role-playing him. I'm very familiar with all of my different players in this group. I have been playing with these guys, most of them for at least 6-7 years now, and I'm good friends with all of them. We're a very consistent group of veteran role players, and Ren's player normally plays the face, and Ren is the face, but he normally plays very affable, nice characters, and Ren is anything but that. Ren is very oppositional with the rest of the party, is quite disliked by the rest of the party thus far, which I'll get into like a little bit of the interactions, and is kind of a pompous asshole, and his player has essentially built him with an arc in mind, because he has 16 hit points and hasn't really struggled at all in life, that when he goes on this expedition, he's going to grow up, and probably grow up very fast. So it'll be interesting to see how that arc develops, because currently he is neutral, true neutral, maybe on the chaotic neutral bend, and Eric, the name of Ren's player, has told me essentially that he could go either way, where he could go good or he could go evil at this point, and he's fairly selfish. So it's very interesting. I think that Ren's interactions and his interactions with his family in his little mini arc was surprising, and there was an attempt on his life, which he managed to pretty easily escape via the help of his magical steed that he summoned using one of his higher level spells. And he quickly made his escape, but he has no idea who wants to kill him in Shortvik, but is currently essentially inserted himself into the expedition and is functioning as Rygon's advisor. In his capacity as one of Rygon's advisors, he recommended bringing in the Iron Rose of Breckland, a master of black strike fencing that he got to witness in a duel. And on his behest, Rygon sent a formal request for this mercenary individual to join the expedition. And that very conveniently leads us to the Iron Rose of Breckland herself, Primrose Crow, or, well, she's known as Primrose Crow. Her true name we'll keep for now. Primrose is essentially a master of black strike fencing. She is a bounty hunter of a noble bloodline which, for one reason or another, is extremely poor, and she sends a lot of money back to her impoverished family as her capacity as a noble. Primrose travels around Breckland on wherever, performing services as a bounty hunter and as a sometimes adventurer, where she exercises her many years of official sword training that many of the Breckland nobility or upper classes engage in. Even the women, and is a master duelist and a master of the Breckland noble fighting style known as black strike fencing, which utilizes a pair of rapiers as a part of that. And is normally used by people who are fighting across the decks of ships, engaging pirates or in different disputes between different Breckland noble houses or guilds or whoever. However, she doesn't really engage much in noble pursuits. She's very much a fallen noble in a lot of ways because she is engaged in a lot of poverty and has had a lot of hard living as she sends most of her money back to her impoverished family. She also has kind of a dark past. She traveled with another adventuring group beforehand, and they met their end at a horrific slaver who was selling slaves to Kiergaard, one of the satellite states ruled by the fearsome Gorgon. Primrose harbors a dark past and has a few interesting bloodline abilities that we won't go into because it links with her mysterious past, and I think it'll be more fun to reveal that stuff as we go along. And Primrose, despite her moniker as the Iron Rose of Breckland, does not like Ren Ulrichsen. Ren was the one who dubbed her with that moniker in one of his most famous poems, and that kind of spread around, which has given her a certain level of fame and infamy, which did bring in some work for her, but also ignored her to no end because it was a very inaccurate and not necessarily flattering poem, to say the least. So when she found out that Ren was behind her invitation to this very profitable expedition, which could do a lot of good for her family, it was a kind of a funny interaction between the two as they kind of argued back and forth and were essentially bickered quite a bit, which is a kind of an interesting dynamic, as I was talking about with Ren's character. Currently, Primrose is a pure fighter, but she will be going into the prestige class of Dervish pretty soon. Like I said, she is a master of black strike fencing, and has the fights with the double like two rapiers and jumps around and will have a very interesting. She'll be kind of the tank of the party for methods of combat, and is essentially along on this expedition for profit and for her own reasons. Perhaps she even wants to eventually relocate her family from the very dangerous environment of like moved-in politics to the maybe relatively safer shores of Breckland, because her family is in more trouble than she yet realizes. Finally, we have Tanal Amarath, our lone elf in the party, and someone who was drawn to this expedition not by an invitation or by knowledge, but by the very earth itself. Tanal is a elf, and a very old elf at that. Tanal was actually around before the Battle of Mount Deasmar, because elves in the Birthright setting are functionally immortal, and has lived a very long time and remembers how things used to be before humans arrived. Tanal is, when Tanal was younger, around the time before the Empire fell, was a part of the Gilean Sedhe, or the Wild Hunt of the Elves, which is a elven hunt which existed, which essentially purged humans from their land. It was the elven counterattack and patrol force of the woods. And in exercising these duties, he accidentally killed a human diplomat from the Empire, from the Onwarian Empire, who was bringing much needed terms to the elven kingdom of Lowbright. Now, the elves of Lowbright didn't really care that some human had been randomly killed by one of their members of the Wild Hunt, who was basically doing their job, but they needed to exercise some sort of punishment on him. Otherwise, it would kill any chance of peaceful resolution they had with the Onwarians. So, in penance, he was exiled and sent away from the Elven kingdoms, where he has lived in seclusion ever since. While living in seclusion, Tanal went a little bit mad. He began to get extremely interconnected with nature, and not only with nature, specifically with insects. Tanal was driven underground and began living amongst insect hives, like in a giant ant hive, where he spent most of his time for like 500 years. So he has a pretty shocking appearance. He subsisted entirely on good berries and insects for 500 years, and is incredibly pale and has incredibly dry, flaky skin, and has a very corpse-like appearance. Tanal is also extraordinarily prejudiced against humans. And aside from disturbing visions of Unshalan threats to his homeland, he would not have been driven to make this compact and join in on this expedition. However, due to these outside forces, Tanal has agreed. And alongside his giant wasp companion, has joined the party. So Tanal, which means a sunflower in Elven, is our party's local druid, and he's specifically a vermin druid focused on controlling different insects and bugs and different things like that. That's going to be the focus of his wild shape, is turning into different insects and monsters. As I said before, Tanal really doesn't like humans, and is also incredibly old and doesn't really know a lot about like modern day Soralia at all, and just has basically lived on his own, and has this like such a connectivity to nature and the natural source of the land that once he has felt these disturbances to the natural order of things, he's kind of riven up like a plague across the land and joined with this expedition, much to the chagrin of the other heroes. He senses that they have a part to play in things to come and has decided to ally with them. And the party thinks he could be fairly useful, but they don't know. Originally, we had a fifth player, who was a elven prince who had found Tanal and brought him along to the expedition. But unfortunately, for their own reasons, that player has had to exit the campaign. So Tanal's connection with the party is tenuous at the moment, but will be built up as time progresses. He is again extremely oppositional with the party. In their first meeting together, Rygon's scouts saw him as a blight across the land. Even though he was growing plants, he was growing different plants and helping yield better crops. He was seen by rural Onwarian and Rurik peasants as casting strange spells and being accompanied by a pair of giant wasps, and has a very disturbing looking figure. But luckily, upon his meeting with Rygon and Ren, went fairly amicably. Ren made some pretty offensive comments directed at Tanal, in regards to the elves essentially deserving to be conquered, which Tanal did not appreciate. But Tanal also referred to humans as murderers and killers and stuff like that, all in very offhanded ways. It's just he's just speaking truth. He's very mercurial. So the interactions between Tanal and the rest of the party will be interesting. Tanal's player tends to play kind of weird, off-the-grain characters. It's just kind of his style, and he generally has somewhat of an oppositional element against the heroes. And something interesting about this is he actually only speaks Elven and Ondu, the ancient Onwarian language, and most of the rest of the party can't communicate him without the use of magic or the intermediary of Rygon, who does speak a little bit of Ondu. Luckily, our wizard does have comprehend languages, so there's a bit of a communication barrier between the rest of the party, which led to some interesting things in their first role-playing encounter. Essentially, our session 0 was just me running these characters through their own solo, separate thing before meeting up and preparing for the expedition they've kind of set forth. There's the party and then about 30 small retainers, a very small force that they are gathered up in the Downs, and it was a lot of role playing and dealing with their own separate things. Rygon met with the Baroness, who gave him a rough overview of the Downs and essentially went into detail about the different power structures there, such as the Anyanka Stormdaughter, who is the supposed regent. If there's any power source, anybody who does control the region, it is Anyanka, who controls most of it through Midjarna village, and she essentially watches over and has authority over most of the Rurik tribes. There's also the Watch, who control Limoges and act as kind of the police force of the region, as well as the previously aforementioned Rurik nomadic tribes who travel throughout. She also went into details about some of the problems facing Dasone, which may come up in the current campaign, and went over this situation. Meanwhile, Primrose was hunting, was far away in Breckland before meeting up with the heroes, and tracked down a Mark who actually knew who she was and knew what her family's rivals were planning, which led her to finally return after many months of being absent to her familial estate to discuss things about their current situation with their rival house, and discuss what needs to be done. Tanal received his vision and then traveled across the lands from far away Laubright all the way down to Dasone, and finally Ren, as I kind of mentioned when I was talking about his character, returned home for the first time. Uh, Essentially was a huge asshole to his family, who weren't, with the exception of his sister, weren't particularly happy to see him. His mother got a very cold reception, and he tried to recruit his brother, his younger brother, to actually join the expedition with them, because his younger brother's a good fighter, and his mother was not having any of it, but did tacitly agree to lend some support to the expedition should it be beneficial to her position in Shorvik. And that's about what went down in the last in our previous session, our session 0. This is probably going to be one of the longer videos I go over, as most will just function as a summary of what's going down and maybe discussing like the things, the blah blah, like around the events going around, like the different work that I put in as a GM to the events that are unfolding. Um, and the next time we get together, the party will actually finally enter into the Giantdowns.